Well, rising viewers probably didn't need research to know this. New findings reveal that the success of social media is driven by hate, particularly conflicting political opinions. The research also found that on social media sites like Twitter and Facebook, negative and more emotional words increased the chances that a post would be shared. Positive expression had the opposite effect. Journalist Zaid Jilani is here to discuss. Thanks so much for joining us on this topic, Zaid.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, so could you break down exactly what this particular bit of research is gauging? Because it's also getting into something that happens not just in the United States, but in other countries, smaller countries, where some of these platforms can have major effects that might feel like ripples here, but are basically hurricanes in smaller countries.
Yeah, so what they did is it was a Jay Van Bevel, who's a professor, psychologist at NYU, and he worked with a team of a couple or two or three other researchers. And what they did is they looked at the major social media platforms where people talk about politics, which is Facebook and Twitter. And what they did is they looked at posts from the most politically charged accounts. So those would be media accounts and members of Congress. And what they did is they tried to measure what type of posts were getting the most engagement, which ones were going viral and getting out there. And they looked at them through a number of different lenses. And so what was interesting is like pro in-group posts, meaning like a liberal post that was boosting liberalism or other liberals, it would have some positive effect in terms of the shares, the retweets, so on, and likes and so on and so forth, that kind of thing. But the thing that performed the best across ideologies, across these platforms, was talking about an out-group. That means a liberal talking about a conservative talking about a liberal, particularly when they were using like negative or kind of moral or emotional words, basically when they were attacking, right? When they were, dunking as the parlance is on Twitter, or they were flaming as the parlance may be elsewhere on the internet. What this shows is that, despite some kind of superficial efforts by these companies to arrange their algorithms and the content that they present to you in a certain way that maybe promotes more positivity, which is what they say they've been doing, it doesn't seem to be working in any way, shape, or form. It seems like really the way on any kind of political social media to get out there, to be viral, to increase your clout, is to be attacking somebody who's in the opposite tribe or camp from you politically. And it was really interesting. The researchers even looked at, it's true that like the social media platforms don't tell us exactly what their algorithms do or how they do it for, proprietary reasons. But they looked at, Facebook had publicly announced that they were changing their algorithm ranking system to value like more deeper forms of engagement, meaning like reactions and comments. And what was really funny was that they found that those posts on Facebook about the outgroups were really effective in generating like comments and reactions, like people, because Facebook now has like an angry reaction, right, where you can put an angry face, and people were using that one a lot, so that was actually boosting those posts. So it's funny that the Facebook post where they announced that changed the algorithm was called bringing people closer together, right? But that's not actually what it's doing. If anything, it's bringing people who kind of agree with each other closer together to bash the other groups of people. So I think what this study shows is that negative stuff really, really works on these platforms. And I think many people would argue, well, isn't that just a reflection of us, how politics is, blah, blah, blah. To some extent, that may be true, but you have to remember, these are not just public squares, right? These are slot machines, right? They are engineered to give you content that's performing in a certain way. You don't just get a blanket view of, whatever's out there on the internet. You're getting something that's actually being curtailed, or actually being selected in a certain way by programs, by algorithms, and by a service. And it seems like what's being selected and what's really driving people is still negativity, despite any changes these companies have claimed to make to their services and their technologies.
Which I think says something about us as users, and that's probably even the more interesting direction to go. And I mean, these platforms are literally designed like slot machines, down to colors and down to flashing lights and down to the literal aesthetic. They're being designed like slot machines to get us addicted. And I'm wondering, this obviously is another scrap in the mountain of evidence that heightens the contrast between the way technology was described in terms of social media 15 years ago, when we were hearing that the viral mechanisms were supposed to kind of wrench us from our echo chambers. And when you look at the fact that what they have actually done is prize anger and prize outrage in a way that heightens the effects of echo chambers. Is that something that tells us, the human reaction to these platforms is going to naturally gravitate towards outrage because there's this condition of anonymity that you can have online that you can't have elsewhere? There's just all kinds of things about being on the internet that, makes human behavior very different, and they're profiting off of that.
I mean, they're definitely tapping into an aspect of human behavior, particularly outrage or public expressions of moral outrage, public expressions of anger, contempt, and disgust. I mean, these are all parts of human nature for sure, and we've seen them manifested long before there was social media. We saw them manifested before there was an internet, right? It's been part of our history and our evolution. However, it's one aspect of human nature, and there are also more pro-social aspects of human nature. And I think that these services operate in a way that taps into one aspect of it as opposed to another. And I think part of that is that, there is a cheap and simple and easy way to make money addicting to people to certain types, to certain parts of our behavior. If we had services, for instance, that kind of were designed around not maximizing engagement, but maybe, it was something that people would use every now and then. You'd have maybe like something like the post office running a website that was just like letting you share baby photos, and there wasn't really much of an algorithm to it. You just kind of meet people as you will. You probably wouldn't use it that much. You probably wouldn't have much of a power over your brain, or any power to develop an addiction. But it could also be, you could also deem that a success by another metric. And the success would be that it isn't promoting the worst aspects of human behavior, right? I think that we sometimes think about success through the lens of what is driving the most profit, right? What is driving the most engagement, the most use? But we know that, excessive use of anything to where it culminates in addiction is not necessarily a success, right? We don't look at Las Vegas and slot machines and think about gambling and all that as the pinnacle of human civilization, right? We know it works. We know it makes a lot of money for some people, and that it really drives a lot of engagement and a lot of participation by people. But we don't necessarily look at that as a success, right? We see it as kind of manipulating flaws in our psychology, right? And I think that's kind of how we should be thinking about social media. The companies will always think that if they're maximizing the eyeballs and screen time, that they are succeeding. But it's not just about that, right? There are other ways to measure the utility of these things, and I don't know that promoting addiction at every level of our society is successful just because it kind of works, and that's kind of what their argument is. So.
Right, and they originally pitched this to us, as you said, as though they were tapping into the good, right? They were manipulating human psychology for the better, and the viral mechanisms didn't turn out to work that way, which I think is a result of naivete on one hand, but now they know that it's not working that way. They realize that, and it seems as though they're utterly inept, or as you say, there's a profit motive. I mean, we look at gambling as a vice. I mean, that's how it's sort of culturally stigmatized and perceived. Why don't we look at arguing online or rage tweeting as a vice as well? I mean, that's essentially what it is. You're being manipulated by big tech engineers sitting in Silicon Valley who have designed the platform that way, particularly to get you to react that way because it increases engagement more than if you're, posting like a very thoughtful thread on the child tax credit. We know that the incentive to do something else is way higher. When is that going to change? I mean, it would have to change, I guess, with the user base to create demand at this point, or it would have to come through legislation. I mean, Josh Hawley has talked about these platforms like slot machines. So I don't know where it goes, but what do you think happens first? Do you think the demand starts to bubble, or do you think it starts coming top down from Washington?
Well, look, I think that in order to have an alternative to this, you have to have someone who's able to build one capably, given the market as it is right now, right? So if, let's say, I raised the example earlier of a post office. If the post office wanted to make a service that was just for like finding friends in high school and sharing baby photos, like Facebook's like original pitch, they could do that, right? It would be very hard for a private independent competitor to do that without interoperability, which means like the different services can talk to each other. So, if you're starting on a new service, it's not like you're on a service that nobody's on, so there's no incentive to be there. But the government could legislate interoperability through, various administrative action or legislative action. And they could also help promote a more kind of competitive market, where people can create services that will serve a lot of the good part of the needs that the YouTubes, Facebooks, and Twitters of the world, and Instagrams of the world are serving, but without necessarily trying to maximize profitability. Because maximizing profitability, you can do that in any which way, right? You can do that through the slot machines and the gambling. But that doesn't necessarily, maximizing profitability does not necessarily mean maximizing success or maximizing utility or social well-being, right? And I think that if we want to have alternatives to these platforms that let us do the things that we value them, which is actually just connecting to people and learning things, and meeting people, learning and experiencing new information, I think it's possible. I think that particularly the earlier internet before there was a Facebook, most people looked at that as just like a net social good by far, I think. And it was working. I think it was working fairly well in terms of achieving a lot of the same goals. I don't think anyone looked at MySpace and thought, okay, MySpace is addicting everyone and promoting political conflict. Obviously Facebook came around and kind of defeated MySpace, but something can come around and defeat Facebook eventually, but I don't think it'll just be organic. Because at this point, Facebook has so much market power that it's very hard to enter into the market and compete with it, and to provide products that maybe would serve the more positive ends of what Facebook is doing, but not promote just the endless kind of conflict and addiction that Facebook is promoting. So,
as someone who was a teenage girl in the MySpace years, I can say that MySpace did promote social conflict, even if it wasn't political conflict. But Zaid, you study these issues closely, and just quickly before you run, I want to get your thoughts on whether considering this along the lines of a public health issue would maybe advance the cause of extracting the good or taking it back. I mean, I remember we were talking on the Federalist podcast a couple months ago about how in the media space, before social media came along, the early internet was great. It had this really robust blogosphere where you had Ta-Nehisi Coates and Andrew Sullivan going back and forth in these actually very useful conversations. Social media comes along and basically creates a climate where that's impossible. Do you think the public health framework is a way to kind of get back to what was working? Because gambling is the instructive example there. If we were all gambling every single day at every single minute, I think we would be eager to think of it as a public health issue.
Yeah, and I think every new technology that's introduced eventually kind of hits that line where we decide that there has to be some amount of oversight or democratic control over it, in order to prevent it from going haywire. I mean, that's everything from when airplanes were introduced, or automobiles, or smoking tobacco, right? Like, these products all still exist within human society. They all serve some function in human society, but we didn't simply leave them to capture markets and operate as the companies see fit. Because if we did, we would still be seeing enormous numbers of traffic deaths far beyond what we have today. We'd be seeing many more airplanes falling out of the sky, and we'd see, probably a lot more kids smoking tobacco without the government's efforts to regulate and tax that. So I think that there should be a similar mindset when it comes to social media companies. We're always told that data is the new oil, right? If you're going to say that, you're going to have to accept the responsibilities that, big oil companies were broken up. They were regulated, and the latest thing is that the externalities they're creating through damage to the climate are also increasingly falling under oversight and taxation and limits placed by different governments. So if we do think that these companies are playing a similar role to railroad companies in the past, to oil companies in the present or the past, then I think we need to realize that this is a perfect domain for a technology that's very useful. We all appreciate having it, but it doesn't necessarily need to be above the government. It doesn't need to be above the democratic kind of commons and sort of the larger kind of social goals we have for humanity. We don't let any technology just kind of run amok, operated by a few dudes in Silicon Valley, right? Or operated by a few CEOs in Texas with regards to oil companies or so on and so forth. We always, at a certain point, decide that as a country or as a society or as a globe, we are at times going to curb the technology for the greater social good. And that doesn't mean eliminating it. It doesn't mean dictating every function that every one of these companies can utilize, but it does mean that they aren't above, the democratic commons. They aren't above society. No technology is. No technology that's ever been introduced has been completely unregulated. And I think having that environment for big tech has not necessarily served us very well. And I think increasingly, within the next 5 years, we are going to see some major regulations placed on tech in the United States, and I think in other countries, and Australia and places have already started this.
Yeah.
And I think right now the big question is how and why they do that, much more than if they will do that, because I think we've all come to the same conclusion about that there is a problem. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. That momentum is building. Zaid Jilani, thank you so much for your time this morning.
thank you.
Always appreciate it. We will be back with more Rising right after this.